Alevon is an organization that was formed for encouraging people to get art out of storage. We work directly with museums, artist estates, collectors, and creating a rental model which then gets that art available to institutions, other museums, and other collectors. Today, I'm very excited because we have two people that are very knowledgeable in the area of art, specifically for Botero. Diana Bramham, thank you for joining us. She's been with Christie's a little less than 20 years. She's been in the Latin America specialist at Christie's for over 10 years. And she has a PhD in art history, and she specializes in Botero. Perfect person for today. Juan Carlos Botero is a published author. He's actually, as of 2023, has published 10 books. He writes a biweekly column for one of the largest newspapers in Colombia. And he is, of course, the son of Fernando Botero. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
It's great to see you again, too.
Same.
So I did want to take a minute. I did want to take a minute to say a thank you to a couple one being Colette for having us here today and making this possible. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Livia Nahas, who's here in the back with Christie's. Putting this together and getting these extremely busy people together is very difficult. I had at one point thought it might be impossible, but through her hard work and perseverance, we're all here, so thank you. So I wanted to just kind of go chronologically and start a little bit at the beginning and focus a little bit on the early days, Medellin, Colombia, your father finding his footing as an artist, and then decides to go to Europe. Mm-hmm. So you could tell us a little bit about that journey and how that affected his.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate your assistance, your time, kind attention. I know it's not easy to come here on a Monday to interrupt your work and everything, so I really appreciate it. Thank you, Daniel, for putting this together. I know it wasn't easy. It's very kind of you, and it's not the first talk that we've had together, and it's always a pleasure. And it's an honor for me to be with Diana, whom we're very good friends from a long time, and she's been so helpful with us for so many reasons and so many times, so I'm very grateful for her company today. So I think that's a great place to start. My father was born in 1932 in Medellin, Colombia. As you all know, for an artist, the most important university, the most important school an artist can have are the great museums where the great works of the great masters are present and where a young student, young lover of art can study them passionately. My father didn't have that opportunity. Medellin was a small town village in 1932 in Colombia. It was very remote from the capital of Colombia, not to mention the capitals of the art centers of the world. So for him, it was a great disadvantage not to have the possibility to see great works of art on a daily basis and in an easy way. For him, it was very, very difficult. At the same time, to be born in 1932 in Medellin, Colombia, had a great advantage. And oddly enough, it was the same situation, not to have present easy access to great works of art. You can ask yourself, how can that scarcity be an advantage, a positive thing? In my opinion, it's a positive thing because of the hunger it creates in somebody who's never had that opportunities. When my father, with great effort, he won a prize in Colombia, and the award, it was the second, it wasn't the first prize, but the second award. It was $7,000 for him, and that time, 1951, was a treasure. His father had died when he was 4 years old, leaving him and his siblings and his mother in total poverty. So for him to have $7,000 was a treasure, and he took that money and he went to Europe for the first time. And for the first time, he saw the great works of art in the great museums. My father always said that he believed that European artists are born tired. What does that mean? That it must be very difficult to be born in Florence and to walk every day as a young child, passing alongside the great works of Michelangelo, of Giambologna, of Ghiberti, Brunelleschi, and Cellini. And then when you're a teenager, somebody tells you, now you do something original and great. The person almost is plastered by the weight of the tradition. For my father, he arrives in Europe in 1951 with a freshness in his vision, a vision that's not limited. That also happens in Europe very often, because the French people tell their students French art is the best, and the Spanish tell their students Spanish art is the best. When he arrives, he saw the totality of the tradition of Europe, and he could use whatever he wanted and, totally squeeze it to his advantage to enrich his own art. So he arrives at Europe in 1951, and he sees these great works for the first time in person. And for him, it was a revelation. It changed his life completely. So I think he arrived to Europe with a degree of passion and hunger that you don't usually find in European artists. And I think that translated into a great respect for the great traditions of art and a great devotion for those traditions. And you can see them present in all his works. He always said that he had never done a brushstroke that had not been authorized by the history of art. And so his reverence to these great masters began at that time. So it's a long explanation, but I think I try to make it clear.
Though that and the hunger, I think, resonates with a lot of people when we think about many of the great founders and everything. A lot of them didn't come from a lot of means. They had that kind of hunger
Right
from the very beginning. Diana, I'm curious. There's been a number of artists that have gone through a similar kind of journey before they achieved real greatness, and that's going through Europe. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on why that getting out of your safe space and into the world, that shapes the art, right?
Yeah, I mean, as Juan Carlos was explaining, he clearly had an awakening. Like he had this hunger and this ambition within him, and then being exposed to all of these things that you haven't seen before shapes your path. And certainly there are other artists that's the story for as well.
And I'm thinking, so he was there in the 1950s. How does that begin to shape, like, what we think of as Boteroism?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's foreshadowing already in that era, right?
Yes. What's very strange and impossible to explain is my father, from a very young age, had an inclination towards the exaltation of volume. You can see that in the drawings and the paintings he did when he was 16 and 17 years old. He did a watercolor at 17 called Crying Woman, and he says that that woman has an arm that seems painted by him nowadays. So he had this, he brought this passion for volume, and when he saw the great works of art in Europe, there's an anecdote that I just have to share with you. When he arrives in Spain, he travels from Colombia, he gets on a merchant ship and he arrives in Barcelona. He sees the first museum in his life and he's totally fascinated, and he moves to Madrid. And one day in Madrid, he's walking at night by close to the Prado Museum, and he sees that there's a window, una vitrina, a window, storefront or whatever, illuminated, and he glances over. It's incredible. A chance event changes his life, and he sees that there's an open book, and the book is a book of Piero la Francesca. It's one of the great frescoes of Piero that's in Arezzo, in the Basilica San Francisco. At that moment, he stops in his tracks, and many years later, he would say that that was the moment that he realized that art was something much more complex, much more beautiful, much more everything that he had ever suspected. And he had never even heard of Piero la Francesca. He had never even heard the name. Pietro and Francesca, who died the day that Columbus arrived in America, the 12th of October, 1492. So, no problem. So, he is so fascinated that he tells a friend of his, hey, come on, let's go look at this. So they buy an old scooter and they travel to Italy, sleeping by the road, camping. And for the first time, he sees the great works of the Renaissance. And he's totally blown away. And he incorporates these elements in his work, the exaltation of volume, the fascination for monumentality, the glorification of form, all these elements that he had intuitively brought before, but he saw confirmed in the great works of the Renaissance. I'm being too long, but I just have to say this. All those elements, those attributes that he saw in the Renaissance were extraordinary, but not color. And it's interesting to point this out because it's an historical mistake, a historical accident. In 1951, colors in the Renaissance paintings were practically impossible to appreciate, to see, because the Second World War had just ravaged the continent. Museums and churches didn't have money for restoration projects. There's a very interesting example, which is Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. Everybody knew that Michelangelo had been a great poet, a great architect, a great draftsman, and a great sculptor, and a great painter in the forms and the way he narrated the biblical stories, but not in color. Because over 500 years, the breadth of people visiting the Sistine Chapel had covered the entire frescoes with soot, and the candles from the ceremonies had covered the paintings in soot. Only in the 1990s, when the restoration between Japanese and Italians were done, and they cleaned this extraordinary place that we all worship, people realized the great colorist that Michelangelo was. When Botero saw Michelangelo the first time, all he saw was gray. So his first works that you see that were influenced by Uccello, by Pietro and Francesca, there's no color. There's no true color. The true color Botero arrives when he sees and lives in Mexico. In Mexico, the color explodes in his canvases. But what's interesting is that it's an historical accident. It wasn't possible to see those colors and to appreciate them just because they were covered. The varnishes had yellowed. It's interesting to point that out, I think.
You know, one of the things that strikes me about this is you're talking about Michelangelo. Michelangelo was also a sculptor and he was a painter. Mm-hmm. And some people say that he considered himself more of a sculptor, even though he did the Sistine Chapel. And it strikes me that your father, it's interesting. He starts in painting, but then in the 60s, he goes to sculpture, and he's doing it here in New York. And I think that's a perfect segue for you. But he's been one of these few artists that I can think of that really has been able to have, you know, success both in those both mediums. And I guess it started in New York, maybe.
Well, it's definitely in the 70s he started doing sculpture. He was in New York until 1972,
yes.
Right? So I think sort of more in France is when he gets more into doing sculpture. But I think the sculpture, like his paintings, I mean, there's a thread that obviously goes through through painting and sculpture, that exploration of volume and form. And sculpture is obviously a continuation of taking it into the 3D realm. So it makes perfect sense that someone who is fascinated by creating, you know, volume and form and figures then moves on to do that so in sculpture.
And I think for most of us, I can think for myself, we experience Botero in sculpture first. That's it's places you can run into it. You know, you don't have to seek it in the same way.
Right.
Which is interesting. So we come at it, I would say most people probably come at it from sculpture first, as far as discovery.
I hadn't thought of that.
And then it goes to, but the other thing that strikes me is you were talking about color. Photography in color was still relatively, I guess, rare. When he was growing up, he probably wasn't seeing any of these things photographed.
Not at all. All he could see were poor reproductions in black and white of the great muralists of Mexico or of the great works of the Renaissance, and he didn't have access to it because in Colombia there weren't those kind of magazines, art magazines, or any kind of. The first things he saw were much later, and that's why when he arrives in Mexico, he's so. But what you point out, Daniel, something that's very important regarding his sculpture. He stopped painting in the 1970s, the beginning of the 1970s, for an entire year to learn the technique of sculpture. And he dedicated himself to learn the technique. And he started with very small things, and then he went on to do bigger works. But what was interesting about those exhibitions, and he did more than 20 in 1992 in the Champs-Élysées in Paris, and then here in 1993 or 94 in the Park Avenue and in Washington, or 20 cities where he did the great works, the great exhibitions. What's interesting is that normally people, what you point out, go to the museum or the gallery or to see the works of art. Here the works of art arrived where people are, and in the middle of the avenues, the most important. And I think it illustrates the power of the sculptures to be able to be present in such grandiose settings and not to be plastered by the context. They're so historically magnificent areas that a work of art doesn't have the strength, the inner strength to compete against that context and emerge victorious would be totally dwarfed. And I remember when my father did an exhibition here in Park Avenue, those works of art, those sculptures surrounded by these huge skyscrapers, what the critics, most of them pointed out was that Botero's works defied the atmosphere in such a natural way, in such a successful way, that they seemed like they'd been present there their entire life. So the works had that inner strength to be able to do that, no?
What do you think his work has done so well in New York? He came here.
Why do I think his work is
Yeah,
so well in
it's
New
his
York?
biggest market, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, in general, New York is the biggest art market, you would
Yep.
say. It's interesting because he had a really fraught relationship with New York. I mean, he moved here in 1960
Yes.
and stayed until 1972.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a long time to be here. And he took a big gamble moving here. He came here with very little money and no friends and little English, and just by sheer grit moved here to become closer to the center of the art world. And he, throughout his life and beginning in 1960, he was his own man. He never joined a movement. He was never in with the abstract expressionists. He was never in with the pop artists at the time. So he was really kind of working against the main trends. And I think to do that is really brave. I think moving to a new country is really brave. And I think it shows his sort of sheer grit and will to do that. He came in 1960, and I mean, pretty much early on had really meteoric success. Dorothy Miller, who was an important curator at the Museum of Modern Art here, he had a serendipitous encounter with her, and she ended up buying one of his most important paintings, a Mona Lisa painting that is still in MoMA's collection. And I think that happened in 1961, so about a year after he arrived. So he definitely had very early on these very important supporters of his work, but at the same time he also had a lot of criticism from people. He had some terrible reviews, some racist reviews, some things he really, it was a tough time for him, definitely. It is interesting that, for someone who, and then he moves to Paris, and I think sort of, you tell me, but I think sort of always felt more at home in Europe than he ever did in New York.
Absolutely, that's true.
But it's interesting because the New York market has so warmly embraced him, despite the fact that he had kind of a distance and a fraught relationship with it.
Yeah, I'm very glad you mentioned that, Diana, because I think very few people do mention that quality, his courage. And in my opinion, that's his most salient characteristic, because I think it took a lot of courage in the 1950s to make paintings, satirical paintings of the Catholic Church in Colombia. Not something you make fun of. To make satirical paintings of the aristocracy and the dictatorships of Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, Took a lot of courage to make an entire series denouncing the guerrilla, the paramilitaries, the drug traffickers, the Colombians in the 1990s. Took a lot of courage to make an entire series denouncing the atrocities of Abu Ghraib, the tortures of North American guards to their Iraqi prisoners, and to make an exhibition of those works in the United States during the time of George W. Bush. And it took a lot of courage, what you say, to come here in the 1960s, where he arrived with $200 in his pocket. He didn't know any English, he didn't know anybody, and he had a very rough time because he never once deviated from his convictions. He always wanted to recapture the great traditions of the past. He always wanted to do a work to create a world of his own, the world of Botero. And those were things that were totally contrary. A figurative artist in the time in which abstract expressionism was almost it was impossible to deviate from that. So it took a lot of courage, and he had a very tough time. I remember him seeing him many times frustrated. We were very small those years, but things started to move along, and then when Marlboro, which is very prestigious galleries, I had 9 important artists at that time, contracted him to represent them. Things started to move and to improve, but he had a very rough time. Just to give you an anecdote to illustrate, all his friends, he lived in the village, in a very, very small, area, in a very small room where he lived and painted. And all his friends were artists as well, and each one of them had eventually given up, and they had to do something else to be able to feed themselves. They became carpenters or they were painters of houses or whatever, and they would stop being artists. And my father always wanted to only live on his art. And one day he recognized he had been defeated. He had been defeated. The total sum of his worth in the world was $27. And he said, tomorrow I have to go do something else to be able to feed myself. And that night, a man knocked on his door and he said, I bring money, I want to buy something. So my father opens the door and this guy enters and he puts his hand on my father's drawings and he says, how much for these drawings? And my father muttered an amount that the guy didn't pay attention. He said, I'll give you $10 for each, not 11, 10, take it or leave it. And my father took it, and with that he managed to gain $700, and with that he managed to continue on his path that night. It was a question of hours. So it was a very rough time for him, but it took a lot of courage, and he never once deviated from his convictions, because he had the talent to do whatever was lucrative at any time in his life, but he never did that. He always was faithful to his beliefs. And I think that took a lot of courage, like you say, Diana.
I'm thinking something we've spoken in the past, and that is, you're talking about courage. He went through a very difficult time with the death of your brother.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I thought the way he dealt with it was very interesting. Mm. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most courageous moments of his life, actually, because my mother and my father divorced when we were very, very young, and my father married again an extraordinary woman who's still alive. Her name is Cecilia Zambrano. They had a lot of difficulty having a child, and finally they had a beautiful boy called Pedrito. Pedrito was a very strange little boy. By 4 years old, he already could speak in 3 languages. You would open an art book and he would say Picasso, Matisse, Chagall. It was an incredible one. He was the most beautiful child you can imagine. And in 1974, there was a car accident in Spain, and he died instantly. And my father almost lost the use of his right hand. That would have ended his career as an artist. He would say that if the doctors would manage to salvage 2 fingers, with that he would be able to continue as an artist. But they had to amputate part of a finger, and they managed to save his hand. The first work he did after that was Pedrito a Caballo, the great masterpiece that hangs in the Museo de Antioquia in Medellin that he donated to Colombia. I don't know if you know, but my father donated over 700 works of art to different countries during his lifetime. That one was donated to Colombia. And he did something that I thank you for pointing that out, Daniel, which is he did something truly astonishing. I think somebody, when they lose a child in that way, in such a horrific way, in such a traumatic way, it's understandable if the person doesn't want to even think about the situation. Breathing becomes almost impossible. My father did something really incredible. He shut himself inside his studio and he did an entire series of Pedrito, painting once and again the face of his dead child. I mean, I can imagine the hell he must have lived alone in his studio doing this incredible series. And what's beautiful about this series is that in all the works, I think, Diana, I hope you agree with me on this, that the paintings are not somber, they're not funeral colors, they're not joyful as either, they're poetic, they're colors and works that are imbued with tenderness and with love and with great love and devotion, but they're not pessimistic, they're not angry, they're not. I think it's a great homage to Pedrito, and I think it's one of the most beautiful series that he did in his lifetime.
You know, I have to think, for you, he was your father.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, he's this artist that we all, we know the name, and I can't help but wonder, when and how did you realize that he wasn't just your dad? He was this, everyone else saw him in a different way.
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a good question. Oddly enough, I know exactly the moment that happened. It's very strange because I wrote a book explaining my father's art called The Art of Fernando Botero, and I did it because I realized my father was one who suggested I do it, and I realized that I had at my favor the fact that I had heard my father talk about his art through his entire life. No other critic or art historian had that knowledge. And at the same time, since I was a teenager, I had been, in a very methodical and disciplined way, taking notes of everything my father said and did. My wife is a witness to this. I had hundreds of notebooks of annotations. Every time we would go to dinner, and afterwards I would sit down and jot down things that he said, things that he did. And the reason I did this is because, to reply to your question, when I was a teenager, I'm sorry if I prolong the answer, but one day we were having lunch, my father and I, in San Ambrose here. It was his favorite restaurant on Madison, and when after lunch we were walking towards his apartment on 79th, and he said, "I have something," and he gave me a book. It was a book of art history, and I looked at it and I said, "It's very beautiful," and I gave it back and he said, "No, it's for you. It's a present." And I said, "Thank you." My father had a look that challenged you, a look that said to you, don't content yourself with what's superficial, go deeper. Go deeper. It depends on you to go deeper. He just made the invitation. He would never point you the way or force you. He would just tell you you're missing something. And he gave me that look at that time. So we stopped in the middle of the street, and I looked over the book. It was a book of some of the most important artists of the world. There were painters of the Renaissance, of other artists of later periods like Velázquez and Goya and Angres, and many modern artists as well, like Picasso and Kandinsky and Edward Hopper and Jackson Pollock and Botero. And I realized it was a great honor to be in that book. And when I was about to tell him, congratulations for being in this book, I saw the look again. And I realized I'm missing something. So I looked at the book for another time in a closer way, and I realized that my father had not only made a great accomplishment to be in that book with a great artist of the history, but at the same time, additionally, of all the artists that were in the book, he was the only one who was alive. And at that moment, I realized my father, as you say, is different from the fathers of my friends, different from the contemporaries that we know. He's one of those rare cases that appear in the history of art in which a great artistic genius is present. So that day, I started taking notes of things that he said and did, and that's why I was able to write the book the way I did. But I remember that conversation perfectly. For me, it was like an epiphany.
I never had an epiphany. He's always just been there. He's just been there, like Picasso and Degas and Chagall and all of them. He's just with them.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah, he always wanted to be in that company.
He is.
He has a very beautiful charcoal drawing, which, by the way, it's truly astonishing because, as you know, almost, Diana, you can correct me on this, but to my knowledge, all artists did charcoal and pencil drawings on paper, not on canvas.
It's true. Yeah, your father.
I think he's the only one who did that because a canvas is a very rough material. When you take a pencil or a charcoal and you put it on the canvas, it's like putting a pastel or a pencil on a stone wall. The result is not. They were the great masters, but to be in that company, it takes a lot of character, I think. No?
Diane, you dedicated yourself to this artist. So tell us, as an art historian, how this speaks to you.
How did it come about? Well, I think part of the reason it may have come about is because I met you. Do you remember how?
Yeah.
You probably don't remember.
I remember perfectly.
You do?
Yeah.
So I remember that when I first started at Christie's, I was a specialist in the 19th century department.
Right.
And I had just started, and because I had just started, I think there may have been like this anonymous inbox where, anyone could sort of write in. So people who were new to Christie's that weren't, quote unquote real clients.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was the new person, I was sort of assigned to reply to these sort of, people who weren't really connected to someone who was important. And you wrote in to, I don't know if it was to me or to this anonymous inbox, and you were interested, I believe it was in the Corot painting.
Exactly.
And I wrote back, because I was told, like, okay, it's your job as the new person to reply to these kind of throwaway inquiries.
Yeah.
So you wrote in, and I replied, and I think we had some back and forth about the painting, and you bought the painting.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I remember that we sort of continued to talk, and I saw your name, and I didn't at all put two and two together. I just was like, well, I'm just doing my job here as someone who's interested in the work of Corot, and I'm going to reply. And then we slowly started talking, and eventually it came out that you were the son of Fernando Botero, and I said, well, that's actually really interesting because my background is in Latin American art, and I'm a great admirer of your father's art, and we started just sort of communicating more, and then I remember you coming in, I think with your daughters really, really little.
Yes.
They were really little, they came in, and you were there too, and I think it was you were looking at maybe a Wilfredo Lam at that point, but I mean, it
what a
must
memory.
have been, like almost 15 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it sort of started then, and then I eventually switched to the Latin American department, and now I just am in constant communication with your family because we offer so many works by your father, and we just constantly need your help, going over things and with questions, and so now it's just. There's no separation. I feel like it's just, but in a good way. It's just sort of your father sort of has taken over my life in some ways. He's definitely kept me awake at night, worrying about things for sure. And
absolutely.
But it's been like a 15-year evolution. Yeah.
What a memory.
Yeah.
I remember that perfectly. I just entered Christie's. and I said I wanted to speak to somebody about a Coro painting that was going to be auctioned.
Yeah.
And then came down
you still have
Diana.
it.
I still have it.
Yeah.
And we became good friends from then on. And it
Yeah.
was just. I wrote a novel called Chance about those small
It was
chance encounters that changes a person's life in big ways or small. And that was one that definitely our friendship was sprung at that moment.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
And I think there's a story for this too, right?
Yes, and
So
there's a
let's-
story for this.
Yeah,
So all these years later, from this one sort of anonymous email, because Juan Carlos and I are in constant communication, he sent me this text of this beautiful painting one day. He said, "Look at this," and I said, "Oh my gosh, it's beautiful! I love it." So this is a really, really early painting by the artist. It's a work that's coming up for sale at Christie's in November. And I think that most people, obviously, when they think of Botero, they think of probably the works from the 80s and 90s that have a really polished finish, that have a sort of more vibrant colors, that have really the kind of classic rotund figures. And this is obviously very different. So this is probably from 1959. It would have been while he was working in Bogota still. He would not have moved to New York. And you sent me this painting, and you said, I know this person who has this, I don't think they want to sell this work, but, they're sort of asking some questions. And I said, this is spectacular. I love this painting. If they would ever sell it, please let me know. And we had some back and forth, and you said, they're not very responsive, but, here's the phone number you could try. And I WhatsApped, and I called, and I emailed, and it went on for months, and I never heard anything back. I was like, well, I guess Juan Carlos was right. They're just not very responsive. And then one day, the son emailed me and said, yes, I understand you've been in touch with Juan Carlos. He, gave me your contact details. He said that I should contact you, and we are thinking about selling the work, so let's talk. So we had a lot of conversations, and a lot of back and forth, and I got really nervous that it wasn't actually going to come, but it actually did, and it's actually here. And we're really thrilled. And it sort of all goes back to that first meeting.
Yeah.
And, then here we are with this painting together that, and the other thing that's incredible about this painting is that it's probably from 1959, and it belonged to your mother.
Yeah.
And she sold it to the current owner after your parents' divorce.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's
And
amazing.
so the current owner has had it since about 1960.
Right.
So
Exactly.
he's had it for 65 years at this point. And I think he said he was 18 years old when he bought it.
Probably.
And he wasn't an art collector at 18. He just saw it and loved it and decided to do it, and probably did not pay very much money for it.
I bring money. I bring money.
I'll have to ask him.
More than $10.
Yes.
More than $10.
Maybe $20. Right? But it's really special. First of all, it's special because one, it's amazing that you sent it to me and that it arrived here and that it belonged to your mother and that now it's here. But it's quite rare to have something like this. We once in a while get works from the 1950s, but there just aren't that many of them.
No.
And to have a work of this scale also is quite spectacular. And it really is, it kind of foreshadows everything that is to come. It has a kind of very rotund figure, the forms in it. But it's really just full of energy and experimentation, I think. It has those very vigorous brush strokes. Parts of the canvas he's actually deliberately left bare, which is very experimental. Other parts he's really built up with this heavy impasto. So to me, it's like this young artist who's just sort of pouring out his energy and his experimentation onto the surface of the canvas. And it has these deep jewel tones that also are very specific to the 1950s, and I think are very speak to Mexico.
Yeah.
As we talked about, he had gone to Mexico in 1956, so he would have gone to Mexico and come back in these very deep, rich colors. I think kind of echo what he would have seen there. I'm sorry.
If he was unhappy or something at that time when he painted it.
It is, it's enigmatic for sure.
probably.
It's not the kind of joyful paintings that you expect in his later years. And sure, he's a young struggling artist and definitely and still in Colombia and trying to make a name for himself. So there's a bit of a struggle there for sure. But I just think it's so striking and so special that it made it
Yeah.
here. So thank you.
No, I'm glad it's here. It's a beautiful work. It's really
Yeah.
astonishing. It's a beautiful, really beautiful.
Yeah.
I think it's done when he was very heavily influenced by Willem de Kooning.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell the presence, the great brush strokes, the energy, and you can tell that he still had a little bit of money because there's red there in the
Yes.
paintings. When he was arrived in New York, he said that the color red cadmium was so expensive that you could feed a family of 5 with a tube of that color, and that's why he wasn't able to afford that color for years. And that's why you can tell it's before 1960, before he arrived in New York. But what I like about this painting, my father discovers his style in 1957 in Mexico. I often give conferences about my father's art, and I always begin with 2 questions. What's the secret of Botero's importance, and what's the secret of his popularity? And I speak for over an hour, which I'm not going to do tonight. But just to give you the answer, I arrive at the end of the conference. The secret of Botero's importance, in my opinion, is that he created a unique, personal, and original, easily recognizable style. And that's important because the style of an artist is the most important contribution an artist can make to the history of art. And the secret of his success is that his art communicates aesthetic delight, communicates beauty, sensuality, and celebrates life. That's something very unusual in modern art, actually. My father's art is not like the tormented anguish of an Edvard Munch or an existential dilemmas and crisis of Francis Bacon. His works celebrate life. But if you take his works from the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, they're very, very different. But in all of them, you can see the evolution of the same style. Here you can see the style is already present. The exaltation of volume, the glorification of form, the contrast between what's small and what's large to increase the sensation of volume, not between what is fat and thin, which is a typical misunderstanding of my father. The reason I wrote the book I did is because I believe my father is one of the most recognizable artists in the world. Anywhere anybody goes to any part in the world, they see a Botero, they can recognize it as a Botero. Doesn't mean they necessarily like it. Maybe they don't like it or understand it, but they recognize it. But at the same time, he's one of the most misunderstood artists, in my opinion. That's why I wrote the book explaining his art. And that's why his style is so important, because it encapsulates the totality of his ideas, his convictions are present in each one of his canvases. And you can see the style already is present there. So when you go to his great retrospectives, you can see the evolution of the style. It's very different, for example, from the paintings you bought, the one you have. It's very different, but the same style. It's interesting. People ask him, why doesn't he change style like Picasso did? Most artists in the history of art discovered and maintained their same style. That's what my father always used to say. If I were to change styles, I would have to change my ideas about art. So that coherence, he always said, the true test of maturity of an artist is the coherence of style. Not only that all his works are done in the same style, but each element in the work is in the same style. When he was a young student in living in Florence, studying the great Renaissance artist in 1952, with his student friends, they would play a game to identify an artist based on a small detail, on the petal of a flower, a strand of hair, a smile, an eye, a finger, because they all realized that an artist's style is present in each, even such a small, simple detail, because what's present there is the totality of their ideas. That's why we say a style is a visible philosophy, and it's present in each of the works.
I was thinking before we open up to questions from the audience, where does Boteroism go from here? Where do you see it going?
Well, he's not going to continue painting and sculpting. But in terms of his market,
His market and his influence.
I always think in terms of the market first, because that's my job. And, you know, I would say we constantly see new clients coming in that are interested in Botero. Or we see lapsed clients that haven't, bought with us in years, suddenly come back and be interested in his work. We have bidders from 6 continents. We have no bidders from Antarctica, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find any artists with bidders from Antarctica. But from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from North America, from South America. There's a huge global base of clients. And there's definitely, we see continued growth in places like Asia, and even in New York, which has, the largest market for Botero. There's still new clients that come in that we didn't know about before, who come in and bid on his work, or come in and, have questions and inquiries. So that's always really encouraging to see. So I think, he's been an artist who's been sort of a mainstay since, we've been selling Boteros since the 1980s at Christie's. And before that, as we mentioned, in the 1960s, people like Dorothy Miller, a curator at MoMA, were interested in buying his work. So he's an artist who, for decades, since the 1960s, has been just really consistently studied. I think, I've never done this, but I think if there was a graph showing the market for Fernando Botero, it might be like this, maybe sort of going up, whereas other artists it might be like this more so. And I think that's one of the things that's really pretty astounding, is that through all of these years, there's been a steady demand, and there continues to be a steady demand.
I agree.
And that's, Picasso you can say that about, Matisse you can say that about. There aren't too many artists that you can say for decades there's been a continued steady market.
Right.
And certainly in recent years it's ticked upward. And then there's always the question, shortly after your father died, there was a bit of a frenzy, and so people have always asked, like, oh, does this mean, there's this frenzy and prices have gone up, or are you expecting it to drop off? And we've always said, well, of course not, because it's never been that way, and so maybe things go up a little, maybe they come down a little, but always it remains steady. So
I agree.
That's what I just see continuing.
I agree, and also because there's an element in his work which I think is very important, which is his universality. When I always say it's interesting that an artist born in Medellin, Colombia, in 1932, in 2 recent exhibitions in Beijing and in Shanghai, he had 1,500,000 spectators. An artist born in that circumstance, to have 1,500,000 Chinese viewers, speaks to its universality, because not only in terms of prices, that a work of my father costs the same in Johannesburg and in Paris and in New York and in Bogota and in Sao Paulo. Very few artists have international prices, but it's not a question of the prices. It's a question of the appreciation. He's appreciated and admired and treasured and collected all over the world. He's exhibited in the most important museums in the world. He's exhibited his sculptures, like we said before, in the most important avenues in the world. So to achieve that level of universality, I think is something truly exceptional. And I'm very glad that my father had the chance to witness in his own lifetime his success. But I always underscore his human dimension, because very few artists get to have that good fortune of being able to experience in their lifetime their success, but very fewer still use their success to help other people. My father did that in a tremendous way. He was a one-man show. His philanthropic works were extraordinary. The biggest home for the elderly poor in Colombia was created by him. He had a number of initiatives to feed poor people in Colombia, which we are now continuing. And like I said before, he donated over 700 works of art during his lifetime, which I think is a degree of generosity that I don't recall any other artist who was able to do that. And he even collected great works of art over 35 years of Matisse, Picasso, Chagall, all the great works, and he donated it.
See it going.
Well, he's not going to continue painting and sculpting. But in terms of his market,
His market and his influence.
I always think in terms of the market first, because that's my job. And you know, I would say we constantly see new clients coming in that are interested in Botero, or we see lapsed clients that haven't bought with us in years suddenly come back and be interested in his work. We have bidders from 6 continents. We have no bidders from Antarctica, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find any artists with bidders from Antarctica. But from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from North America, from South America. There's a huge global base of clients. And there's definitely, we see continued growth in places like Asia, and even in New York, which has, the largest market for Botero. There's still new clients that come in that we didn't know about before, who come in and bid on his work, or come in and, have questions and inquiries. So that's always really encouraging to see. So I think, he's been an artist who's been sort of a mainstay since, we've been selling Boteros since the 1980s at Christie's. And before that, as we mentioned, in the 1960s, people like Dorothy Miller, a curator at MoMA, were interested in buying his work. So he's an artist who, for decades, since the 1960s, has been just really consistently steady. I think, I've never done this, but I think if there was a graph showing the market for Fernando Botero, it might be like this, maybe sort of going up, whereas other artists it might be like this, more so. And I think that's one of the things that's really pretty astounding, is that through all of these years there's been a steady demand, and there continues to be a steady demand.
I agree.
And that's, Picasso, you can say that about. Matisse, you can say that about. But there aren't too many artists that you can say for decades there's been a continued steady market. Right. And certainly in recent years it's ticked upward. And then there's always the question, certainly after your father died, there was a bit of a frenzy. And so people have always asked, like, oh, does this mean, there's this frenzy and prices have gone up? Or are you expecting it to drop off? And we've always said, well, of course not, because it's never been that way, and so maybe things go up a little, maybe they come down a little, but always it remains steady. So
I agree.
That's what I just see continuing.
I agree, and also because there's an element in his work which I think is very important, which is his universality. When I always say it's interesting that an artist born in Medellin, Colombia, in 1932, in 2 recent exhibitions in Beijing and in Shanghai, he had 1,500,000 spectators. An artist born in that circumstance, to have 1,500,000 Chinese viewers, speaks to his universality, because not only in terms of prices, that a work of my father costs the same in Johannesburg and in Paris and in New York and in Bogota and in Sao Paulo. Very few artists have international prices, but it's not a question of the prices. It's a question of the appreciation. He's appreciated and admired and treasured and collected all over the world. He's exhibited in the most important museums in the world. He's exhibited his sculptures, like we said before, in the most important avenues in the world. So to achieve that level of universality, I think is something truly exceptional. And I'm very glad that my father had the chance to witness in his own lifetime his success. But I always underscore his human dimension, because very few artists get to have that good fortune of being able to experience in their lifetime their success, but very fewer still use their success to help other people. And my father did that in a tremendous way. He was a one-man show. His philanthropic works were extraordinary. The biggest home for the elderly poor in Colombia was created by him. He had a number of initiatives to feed poor people in Colombia, which we are now continuing. And like I said before, he donated over 700 works of art during his lifetime, which I think is a degree of generosity that I don't recall any other artist who was able to do that. And he even collected great works of art over 35 years of Matisse, Picasso, Chagall, all the great works, and he donated the entirety of his collection to Colombia in the year 2000. And I think that's, for me, besides being an artist and everything, I think as a human being, he's an extraordinary individual, and those acts, in my opinion, demonstrate that, no?
Yes.
Mm.
Beautiful.
Questions?
Who was the guy that bought the 70 pieces for $10?
Does he still have them?
Great respect for him. That's one of my favorite artists.
He wasn't a collector. He was more like a pirate, and
Hey, good for
and
him.
we never knew who he was. He never gave his name, and we never knew what happened to those
You never
drawings.
found those 70
No,
pieces? Oh,
no,
wow.
we never found.
Wow.
There were 70 works.
70 works.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, and but we're very thankful to him because he literally saved his life that night. You know,
Are you gonna be able to recognize them if you see them?
maybe I don't know. This was he was having a very tough time, so it'd be interesting to see what's expressed there. No,
Well, they would have been after this, right?
it would have been just
Yeah.
after that, maybe a year or 2 years after that.
He was wanting to give, remember, he was
Yeah.
complaining. That's a very nice story.
Yeah, that's true. What my wife says, what she says is that when my father decided to do the donation of Colombia, he realized that his collection of art, that, like I said, he spent years collecting, he didn't have certain artists that he never bought because a question of taste. He didn't care for their works. But when he decided to give the gift to Colombia, he realized that those artists should be present for the collection to be totally representative of the great traditions of the 19th and 20th century of art. So he started buying the works to donate them. A third of everything he donated at the end were purchased after the decision to make the donation to Colombia. At that time, I was the only one of his sons living in Colombia, and I was I helped a lot to make that donation happen. And I always say that, in my opinion, that's the best idea he ever had in his life, to make that donation, because it's something that, for example, New York, you may take for granted. But in Colombia, to be able to see forever great works of art by Picasso, by Chagall, for free, is something that was not possible before. My mother was the director of the Museum of Bogota, Modern Art of Bogota, and she would every now and then bring a great exhibition, but they would leave. But everybody can enter the Museum of Bogota and in Medellin without paying a dime and see these great works forever. They're in donation forever, so I think it's a great thing. I'm sorry, you had a question?
I'm curious to know the starting bidding. The estimate is $350,000 to $450,000, which is a conservative estimate.
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the personal insight. It's really very invaluable and very enriching. And I wanted to ask talking about the legacy of Botero and thinking about it from a market perspective, aspects of documentation, verification, authentication,
Mhm.
catalog resume are important. Is there, can you share any thoughts in that direction?
Yes. It's a very good question. I appreciate it. When my brother and my sister were creating the Fernando Botero Foundation as we speak, and we are also we're in conversations with somebody very important, I can't tell who yet, to do the catalog raisonné, which I think will be fundamental. I'm sure will be troubling Diana immensely with that project. And so we're working because our idea is to continue to promote my father's legacy. In my personal case, for me, it's a belief, it's almost like a political cause. It's something that I truly believe in a very passionate way, to defend his art and to make exhibitions. We've done already a number of exhibitions since my father passed away. We did one in Barcelona, one in Rome, both beautifully created by my sister. She has great taste. And there's one now in Baku. And then we're going to continue doing exhibitions in Singapore and Taiwan. So we have a lot of work right now, but it's all in gratitude to my father for what he did. No.
So it seems like your father was obviously very prolific, but I mean, do you have any idea of, there must be hundreds of works out there that no one's even, they're not cataloged or?
Yes.
I mean.
Yeah.
That's.
I once asked my father how many works of art did he do, and this was a long time ago. He said at that time it was more than 5,000 paintings. He probably did more than 3,000 drawings. He probably did more, and over 500 original sculptures. You know that for each sculpture there's eight works. He was incredibly prolific, but something I always underscore is that he was very prolific, but at the same time incredibly generous, because he did 3 entire series of paintings that he knew he was going to donate. He did the entire series of Abu Ghraib that he donated to the University of Berkeley in California. He donated the entire works of the violence of Colombia that he did in the 1990s to Colombia, because he believed that it was immoral to make a profit out of other people's suffering. And he donated the entire series of the Via Crucis, the Way of the Cross, which was a series that he did in 2010, 2011, which is, for me, one of the most powerful series that he ever did. And he donated entirely to the Museum of Medellin in Colombia. So to be able to do these works and give them away, I think was astonishing, you know?
I actually, one of the things, when you're talking about the market, I was curious. There's sculpture and there's painting. Do they correlate, the market? With the sculpture and the...
You know, every work is unique. I mean, even a sculpture, there can be editions of 6, but I would say that every work is unique in a sense, and that, you know, I can't say like, oh, the paintings sell better, or all sculptures sell better. It really depends on the specific work, right? So this painting, for example, I mean, this has amazing provenance. It's a gorgeous painting. It's an early painting, so it's not something that I would expect we're going to have lots of bidders from Asia on, for example. So is this going to set a record for the artist? No. I think it should, because I love it. And there's certainly clients that I'm going to talk to who I know will love it and feel the same way. But that's sort of a different thing. Then I would say you might have a work from the 1980s or the 1990s that's a more classic, polished work. Or I can give the example of the work that's currently the artist's record that Christie sold, the musicians. So that's a work from the 1970s, and it has something like 8 figures in it. It's this incredibly lively, beautiful scene. It's a classic subject that you expect from the artist. It's musicians, it's fun, it's lively, it's huge, it's beautifully executed. You know, something like that. Yes, when we had that painting, we were like, we nailed it. This is amazing. We shouldn't say we nailed it. Botero himself nailed it. But when we had that painting, it was like, this is so spectacular. And we knew it was going to be spectacular. And we had bidders from all over. I mean, bidders that we normally have that bid on Botero, and you know, clients that we never would have thought of bidding on it, because that was something that really resonated. Sculptures are also a totally different thing. The monumentals, the really big ones, those are really exciting to handle and can certainly set records. You know, we first had the record in 2022 for a monumental sculpture. I was the auctioneer for that, so that was super exciting. And then a couple years later, there's a horse that sold better, so that's now the second highest record. So things that are monumental sculptures can sell super well. Things that are, you know, these classic large-scale multi-figure paintings can always sell really well. But you'll also have, you know, just these really special works. I mean, something like this, but also, you know, just beautiful drawings. I mean, your father was an amazing draftsman.
Yes, he was.
And, you know, those aren't maybe things that are going to set records at auction, but they are things that can be super special, that bring people in, that, you know, that you have just, you know, people are just sort of astounded by the skill of the artist. And those things can do very well. So, you know, it's really, it depends on each work. There's so many factors that go into why a work of art achieves the price that it does, that it's sort of hard to make a blanket statement of like all paintings sell more than sculptures or vice versa or something like that. But,
And the condition of the work
and the
depends.
condition of the work and the provenance of the work and all of those things matter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.